Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the second lecture on factor markets. We're actually going to do some graphing, and that's all we're actually going to do on this one. So the first part is graph of a perfectly competitive factor market in a firm in long-run equilibrium. And we're going to do a labor market for this one, just to kind of show what that would look like. But the differences are pretty small. It's really just in labeling how we're going to do different stuff. If it's perfectly competitive, then actually it's going to look really similar to a perfectly competitive product market. So again, we have product markets where stuff bought and sold, goods and services, and then we have factor markets where the factors are bought and sold. So we have price and quantity, except for labor, we really don't like price. It's icky. There's an implication when we say we're buying labor. So we usually use the term wage to refer to that. But other than that, it's exactly the same. You have an upward sloping supply. Sometimes folks like to put a little S to say, or an SL to say that's the supply of labor. That helps them remind them that, hey, in the labor market, the supply of labor is actually the workers. You don't need to do that if you don't want to. You just want to put a D, that's fine. Or you can put D sub L, doesn't really matter. There's going to be an equilibrium wage, an equilibrium quantity in the market that's paid. And then a firm, we need a firm. Here's our firm. Representative firm paying the wage. Because this firm is in perfect competition, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of identical sellers of labor and thousands of identical firms buying this particular factor. And so actually we would call this firm a wage taker. So this firm is a wage taker. And why do we say that they're a wage taker? Well, because it's perfectly competitive, that means they must be a wage taker. And that actually means that this market wage, whatever it is the wage that the firm actually pays. So the wage the firm pays is this value. It should be horizontal. Whoop. Make that a little bit horizontal. Come on, Daniel. You should be good at this by now. Horizontal line, but it's also equal. So the wage that the firm pays is equal to the marginal factor cost. So the MFC, the marginal factor cost, is the same as the wage, right? If we paid the worker 15, then that's how much their wage is, but it's also how much the additional cost of hiring that worker was. And if we hired the second worker for 15, then that's how much the marginal factor cost was. So it's the same value. It's like our Mr. DARP, but it's in a factor market. Now, the trick's going to be actually to remember this is actually the supply curve to the firm. So this is people's willingness to sell their labor to this firm. It's a horizontal line. It's perfectly elastic. What that tells us is that if this firm were to try to pay less than that wage, nobody works for this firm. Nobody's interested in working for them. So this is actually the supply of labor to the firm. Now, from the firm's perspective, also, they have a demand for labor, and it's made up of the marginal revenue product. And so the marginal revenue product is actually going to look like this, MRP. And that's the demand for labor from the firm, right? The firm's demand curve for labor. And so from their perspective, the marginal revenue product is going to rise a little bit at the beginning. That's because the first couple of workers are going to have higher marginal product, right? You have that specialization of workers is going to cause their marginal revenue product to rise. And then at a certain point, though, they peak and then they start to diminish. That's because the marginal product of each additional worker gets a little bit less and less, and that makes the marginal revenue product of each worker a little bit less and less. So they're going to hire, though, at the quantity where MRP equals MFC. And that's the firm in long-run equilibrium. That's all you got to do. There's no average cost curves. There's none of that kind of crazy stuff on here. It's literally just that simple. Now we're going to show what would happen if there's an increase in factor demand in a perfectly competitive factor market and the firm. So this one's going to be a little bit tricky, but we're going to start in that equilibrium. So we're going to be nice and quick, hopefully speed this video up just a little bit. Quantity, wage, demand, supply, over here. That's our MFC. That's our MRP, right? And we know that the firm originally is here, QF, and we're going to say there's more demand. So what would that happen? Well, if there's a greater maybe price of the output product, or maybe the workers got more productive all of a sudden, or maybe there was a new technological development that caused them to be more productive. But there's a host of things that can make the product itself more expensive. So think about there are 5 shifters of demand: the number of consumers, the expectations about future prices, related goods, income, and tastes and preferences. If any of those change, then that changes the price of the product. That would actually change the demand for the workers that produce that product. So let's say that maybe there are more consumers, or maybe they developed a greater taste or a preference. That would increase the demand overall, right? but it's also going to increase the marginal revenue product. And so technically, every single worker is going to be a little bit higher, right? It's literally increasing actually that marginal revenue product. We're going to call it a rightward shift. Now, what's tricky here is we wouldn't go directly over, right? The firm's going to hire more workers, but it's not just going to be at this same old wage. And that's not going to happen at the same old wage because in the market itself, there's a greater demand for the workers. And so there's a greater wage paid in the market with more workers being hired in the market. But that higher wage in the market means this firm is actually going to pay at that new market price, or the wage, the marginal factor cost, and that's going to be up and to the right of where we first started out. Now, it may be because it kind of depends on like the relative shifts, right? If we shifted up that a whole lot, if, for example, this marginal factor cost shifted all the way up to up here, then actually it would just be directly up, and that firm would end up hiring essentially a larger number of workers. But you have to think about it at this kind of larger value is a way to kind of conceptualize that one. So we're going to be up and to the right, just as we would see an up and to the right over here. Now, this last one, so again, quantity of the worm firm hires here, and the wage paid goes up just a little bit. For this last one, we're going to show what it would look like for a minimum wage. And so this is going to be a little bit different from the two pictures that we just drew. Quantity, wage. And we're going to do demand and supply just like before. So we're starting in equilibrium for all of these, right? That's our MFC, and that's our MRP. And we know the firm's going to hire Q sub F, and we know Q sub M, and this is W star, we'll say. And we know that the firm is also paying W star. So we said the government puts in maybe a minimum wage. Well, the minimum wage would be set above whatever that equilibrium is. So this would be, say, W min. Well, that's going to cause the marginal factor cost of every single worker to rise to MFC equals W min. Because now every worker is getting paid that minimum wage. That just makes the marginal factor cost that much higher. There's going to be fewer workers hired in the market, right? Because the demand is much smaller, and the firm is going to hire QF1, a few fewer workers as well. Now, a really tricky question that sometimes gets asked here, right? You can think about is what happened to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired? Is it greater than, less than, or the same as the marginal revenue product from before? And if you're not really paying close attention, you go, well, I don't know. But think about it here. The MRP of the last worker was here. And now we're hiring QF1. So that actually means the MRP of the last worker hired is greater than the MRP of the last worker hired from before. So that's a little bit of a tricky question. That's because we're not hiring as many workers. And the reason we're not hiring as many is because the marginal factor cost is now higher. So this would lead to unemployment. So sometimes these get asked as like, how many workers are unemployed? That would be the distance between the demanded and the supplied in this market. And so we could actually find that here, right? So it's that amount is unemployed. But sometimes these questions also are asked as how many workers lost their jobs as a result of this? Well, from the firm, they lost this many jobs, right? But from the actual market, they lost this many jobs. So between QM to QM1, that's how many jobs were lost. The total amount of unemployment, though, is larger than that. And that's because, again, there are some people who are now willing to work for that higher wage that aren't actually getting jobs. So hopefully this helped you kind of making sense of a couple of scenarios involving perfectly competitive factor markets and also just how to draw them. I'll see you next time.